ready? This is going. We're doing the thing.
Good.
All right. So we are going to be making scones today. We have a helper. Emily's going to help. Yep, you're going to help.
That's not very helpful.
So all ovens are different. So, all right, now you're being an issue. Okay, we're done talking to you. All ovens are different. For baked goods like scones and muffins, I like my oven at 385. I find most ovens that's a pretty good temperature. Obviously, ovens working with a time or temperature, so 350 is acceptable. For baked goods like scones, I do prefer to have a little crispier crust to it, so the 385 does cook the outside to a bit more of a golden brown and crispy around the edges. Other thing with scones, this is going to be the Eureka compass style of scone. So the batter itself is not going to be super dry. A more traditional English scone is going to have a drier batter where the batter is almost to dough consistency where you can roll it out and cut them into those squares or triangles or whatever. I prefer more of a drop biscuit style scone. It's just a few less steps, and then you're not sitting there grabbing a scone out the door, choking out it in the car because it needed some moisture like jam or something added to it. So that's what we're going to be working with today. Once the oven is on, the next thing that you want to do is begin to curdle your milk. So when working with vegan baking, curdling of the milk, I am using coconut milk. You can use pretty much any plant-based milk that you like. I'm using coconut milk because of the coconut milk and the almond milk that were in the fridge. The coconut milk was opened a little longer ago. So that is, want to use this up. So I am getting a pretty level 1 1/4 cup of coconut milk. I'm going to sneak into the fridge real quick and grab the apple cider vinegar. There's a couple things that happen with adding apple cider vinegar. That's a scant tablespoon of apple cider vinegar. With the flour blend that I'm going to use for this batch of scones, I was all right being a little heavy-handed with that. So what it does is it actually, two things that are happening with the apple cider vinegar. One is it creates some curdles in the milk, which changes the thickness and the viscosity of the coconut milk or almond milk or soy milk or whatever that you're using. And then when it bakes in the crumb, you're going to have a little bit more creaminess and moistness to the crumb. The other thing that happens with the vinegar on a chemical molecular level, baked goods like this don't get yeast. This is going to get baking powder. Now, you could also use baking soda. The difference between baking soda and baking powder is the soda is the sodium bicarbonate on its own. Baking powder has a couple other things added to it that allow it to leaven without any acids brought in there. Now, the vinegar is acidic enough that it actually increases the rise and fluffiness that you'll get in the crumb, as opposed to just using straight up plant-based milk. So outside of creating a richer depth of flavor and creaminess to the crumb, it helps it fluff up a little bit. So that's why I always add the apple cider vinegar. If you're just, somebody shows up and you want to just whip up some scones, a white vinegar will work. I've even used rice wine vinegar Sunday morning, sort of pinch. But just a little bit of vinegar in there to curdle and enhance your plant-based milk is really important. I am going to be making a apple cinnamon scone today. So I'm also going to grab a little bit of vanilla. And I really never use measuring spoons for vanilla. I am a fan of just 1 capful of vanilla into there. And now we are going to let that set aside. So I've already diced up some apples. I'm going to dice one more. We're going to do a little knife skills here. Anything with baking, from roasting vegetables, anytime that you're cooking vegetables together, the most important thing is the uniformity of the size of each piece of apple. You don't want them, one, to be much smaller than some other, and then you get this weird big chunk of apple that didn't cook the same as the rest. Same with potatoes, onions, anything, squash, in soups, roasting, working to get the most uniform shape of your diced produce will enhance the baking and eating experience immensely. So with any piece of produce, basically what you want to do is break it down into a way that you're going to be able to cook it or chop it safely and in a more controlled manner. So I am coming through, and the first thing I'm going to do is bring these into small little discs. Now I have a nice flat surface on those apples that's going to be much safer than balancing an apple. And now I'm to a flat surface there. Bingley, sit. You missed it. All right. One for the guy. Make sure there's nothing in the oven that's smelling for some reason. Okay. We were roasting chestnuts in there last night. So then, again, that there. And just like that, we've got nice, evenly diced. The other thing about breaking it down like that is if you're not working with a ridiculously sharp knife, and now these are my home knives, I do not sharpen them as much I do the knives at the shop. I did hit it with the steel a little bit, but cutting through the skin of an apple can be difficult, and as you then just break it down where there's those openings in it, the blade goes through much easier. And anything chopping on a flat surface, potatoes, even cutting them in half so you just have a flat surface that you're working with, really helps it hold down, as opposed to if I was going to turn that there, that's really awkward. We're just going to do it that way. And then then even if it mixes up a little bit, just get them back in line like that, and you're coming through just fine. And that is how you very quickly make a nice petite diced apple. So that's 3 apples. That's roughly 3 cups of apples there. I always go a little heavier on the produce that I put into the scones. I just like them to be a little bit more nutritious than just the carbs and sugars and stuff from the batter. So some people don't like something so packed with produce, but for this, apples this time of year, I'm using what is roughly 3 cups of apples. Now we have the oven warming, we have our milk curdling, and we are going to begin to make our dry blend. So I pulled out my already ground organic golden flaxseed meal from the fridge. If you have a really nice blender, a Vitamix or even like a Magic Bullet, there's nothing wrong with buying whole flaxseed and just grinding them as you need them. Here we go through the flaxseed pretty quickly. So we just, once this is opened, it stays in the fridge. The oils in flaxseed are rather volatile and they will get some off flavors pretty quickly. So I am using a 1/4 cup measure. There are some things that are just going to get a 1/4 cup. There are some things that are going to get a 1/2 cup. There are some things that are going to get a cup. But to decrease the amount of dishes I have to do after this, I'm going with the 1/4 cup scoop for this. So we are putting in flat 1/2 cup of organic ground flaxseed. Rolling back. This is just evaporated cane sugar, and we're putting in a 1/2 cup of that. Really not the biggest fan of super sweet scones. And just for a little added flavor, and again, I really like what this does for increasing the nutritional value of a baked good. And it does do some wonderful things to making a slightly creamier crumb inside the scone. This is almond flour, super fine ground. And I'm going to put in a 1/2 cup of that as well. And now we have our all-purpose baking flour. Now, all-purpose baking flour tends to be a lower gluten content, so it's not going to get as elastic, but it will crisp a little bit better, and in general is just going to be more what you want to use for baked goods. Cookies, don't use bread flour for this. You could in a pinch, and certainly if you are making bread, don't use all-purpose flour. It's more of a pastry flour. So that was 2 cups of all-purpose flour. Now, the important thing about doing all the dry ingredients on their own is this lets you get the seasonings. This is a scant teaspoon of salt. And then we've got teaspoon of dried ginger. A teaspoon of cardamom. And 2 heavy teaspoons of cinnamon. Now, not only do cinnamon, ginger, and cardamom taste good, they're also really good for you. They are in traditional Chinese medicine. All 3 of them are warming elements. Cardamom specifically is very good for your cardiovascular system. Ginger is an antioxidant, rich spice, helps with lung health, and cinnamon has been shown to have cognitive and nervous system benefits. So now we are going to come right back, and this is our Rumford aluminum-free baking powder. And we get a solid tablespoon of baking powder in there. Now, at this point, we're going to whisk all this together. There's a couple things that happen with doing the whisk over the spoon, is it does help to break up a lot of the chunks that will form in there. And gets everything, specifically the baking powder and the salt, evenly mixed. And there we have it. Awesome. Now, reach in here real quick again. I have our Melt organic coconut milk based vegan butter. And that is just going to go straight in. You definitely want that to be cold. You do not want to try to use a warm or just putting oil in instead of it. The cold shortening. Now I've got my pastry cutter here, and there are folks who use forks, there are folks who will just use their hands, but as I'm mixing this in there, we coat the shortening with more of the flour, and what's happening here is this is what gives that nice kind of flakiness to it. This is what you would use if, obviously different proportions of shortening to flour, but doing a pie crust. And chopping a cold shortening into it is what makes a scone very different than a muffin. Some people say that muffins are just scones that believed in miracles, but they're actually just scones that got liquid oil instead of shortening. So this is going to make for a great moist scone, but not one that's going to rise up and be too airy. So this is definitely a step that you don't want to scrimp on. And you can begin to see those pebbles forming. There are all sorts of fancy pastry cutters that are out there. I really just recommend that you get one that has a point and blades to it and not the wire ones that tend to mash more than chop. So this also gives us another step where we're making sure that all of the dry ingredients are fully mixed in there. Here, the closer that you can get to a very uniform amount of chunks of oil matters, but if some of them are a little bit bigger, it's not going to ruin anything. You just might see that there's a scone here or there that has a little bit more oil coming out of it at the beginning of the bake. But you don't want them to have too many of those because, right, as that melts much faster than the batter is going to bake, you will lose a lot of that oil, and it can make for a not as pleasant textured scone. So that was about a minute and a half, 2 minutes that I went through, and that's what that looks like there. All right. At this point, I want to toss in the apples. There are different schools of thought on this. Oftentimes people add the whatever, apples, berries, whatever you're going to put in once you've already made a wet batter. What I like is when I do this, the salt in the batter or the salt in the dry mix and the dry mix itself will actually start to pull a little bit of the moisture out of the apples into the flour mix, and you tend to get a little bit more of the apple essence into the actual batter itself, and the apples, as they are going to cook, as the batter cooks, wind up having a much better texture, in my opinion. So there's all of that. Here's our 1 1/4 cup of coconut milk and apple cider vinegar and a top cap full of vanilla. And now we are going to add in a 1/2 cup of, well, we're going to call that a scant 1/2 cup of olive oil. And to substitute that liquid in there, I'm just going to put in, you're going to want at least a 1/4 cup of oil in that, but total liquid that you want is 1 3/4 cup. Spatula, and then you have a nice well in the middle of your bowl there. In goes the liquid, scraping in everything that we got. And then we're just going to begin folding in from the sides. With scones, you want everything basically like just mixed. And here you are going to begin to experience that you don't want necessarily all of that. You want to agitate and work the gluten too much in the batter. We have our baking pan right there. You can oil the baking pan. Scones, they're going to pop right off of there. Again, the shortening that's in it creates enough of a, we'll say a non-stick surface as the bottom of the scone bakes, that you can oil it if you want to, but scones, if you have a good pan, if you have an old just crusty pan that stuff sticks to all the time, definitely you're comfortable oiling it. If you're a parchment paper devotee, certainly go with that, but I'm really just going to scoop these right onto this pan and they will work just fine. Other thing that you can do is, and I have done before, is cook scones in a cast iron pan. They, just get the pan warmed up in the oven once you start it, and you can pull it out and put the scones right into that and then back in. That can be, makes a little richer crust to the bottom of the scone. Some people like that, but I'm just going to use a standard baking pan right now. Start scooping these out, making sure that they are evenly placed on the pan. With an ice cream scoop, it's the best way to sort of measure the uniformity of them. They will spread out a little bit. They will probably, some of them will touch other ones, but a lot of these, with the oven at 385, a crust is going to form on the outside of that and keep them contained pretty quickly. All right, now, baked goods in the oven, you want them in the middle, too close to the bottom, too close to the top. They will cook unevenly, so I have this at the very middle of my oven. There we go. Timer. We are going to set that for 20 minutes to start, and then we'll come back and check that. Watch your nose. So that was just the 20-minute timer. We're going to take a quick look at these. Yep, they have stopped spreading out. I'm going to spin them. Regardless of how good your oven is, always flip things over. We're going to set that up, and we are going to do another 10 minutes on those scones right now. All right. So I checked them at 10 minutes, and I put another 4 minutes on the timer. So now this is 20 minutes. We cooked them. We took it. We turned the tray around, and we put another 14 minutes. Yep. So I'm going to say these are done. They could probably go a little bit longer, but we're starting to get some nice browning at the peaks there. And I do not want these to dry out too much. So we're now, before we try anything to move them off of that, we're going to turn the oven off. And we're just going to let these sit for about 4 or 5 minutes, and then I'll come through with the spatula and we'll pop them off and put them onto a cooling rack.